Hey guys, how's it going? I'm Graham, this is Bike Bros, and we are having a look at the Marin DSX 2. It is November of 2025 right now. This is considered officially a 2026 bike, which means this is probably going to be a relevant review for the next couple of years with long life cycle bikes. So to start with, this is the DSX 2. It is the third or the best of a three-line Marin DSX lineup. This particular one, $15.99 in Canada or $13.99 USD. The other models in the DSX lineup, the base DSX, $9.99, and the DSX-1, $13.99. In today's video, if you haven't seen any of these before, what I do is I go over the specifications, I'll tell you the weight, I'll tell you some things about how the bikes fit, their usage case, and hopefully by the end of the whole video, you're going to understand this bike better than the guy at your local bicycle shop. Unless your local bicycle shop is right here. So we'll start with the main features of this DSX2. Firstly, this is a flat-barred gravel bike. The flat bars meaning that we're not looking at drop bars up here. The gravel bike meaning basically between these 45mm wide WTB Riddler tires and the general shape of the bike, we're looking at something that is designed for more than just going on pavement. The weight on this, 24.9 pounds, or those people who operate in kilograms, 11.3 kilograms. So the general features, we've got an aluminum frame, a carbon fiber fork, through axles, including on the back here on this through axle, we've got a UDH rear derailleur hanger. And what that is going to mean is either if you have to replace the derailleur hanger and you're anywhere in the world, this UDH or universal derailleur hanger basically means you shouldn't have an issue tracking down a hanger. Secondarily, it also means that if you ever wanted to put on any SRAM transmission drivetrain parts, it will fit directly onto this bike, though I think that that is a pretty minimal percentage of the population that want to do that. Aluminum frame, all the mounts as far as being able to put pannier racks on. We've got a couple sets of threaded bosses at the back, a couple up here, panniers, fender mount down here. One of the things that makes this bike quite special in the way it handles is it's got quite a compact rear end. So in the comments on the previous two versions of this, the DSX and the DSX-1 that I've done, there have been a few people asking about comparables, things like Giant Fast Roads or Escapes, Trek FX Sports, I believe, and maybe even Specialized Cirrus, and what makes this different from those bikes. I would say the main thing is that those are flat-barred road bikes or commuter bikes. They're not bringing basically the sort of geometry that makes this thing so fun and so stable, and not bringing the tires or the tire clearance that makes this thing pretty widely versatile. So it's kind of lumped into that category. A lot of people would cross it over if they're thinking about a commuter bike, but if you do want to have something that you can go ride some simple single track and gravel roads, all that sort of stuff, this is going to work well. Now, one of the questions when people ask also about gravel bikes is, can I put drop bars on this bike? And vice versa, we see people with drop bar gravel bikes, can I put flat barred handlebars on there? Speaking not so good today. I would say, yes, you can put drop handlebars on this bike, but it would be practically overly expensive and probably a pain in the butt. What you're better off doing is, on this bike, we typically will recommend actually putting a higher rise mountain bike handlebar on here because the front end is pretty low. But you either put a higher rise handlebar on it to make it feel a little bit more like a mountain bike, or you put on something like a Surly corner bar on here, which will give you a lot of the sort of feel of a drop bar, but without having to change your controls here. And that is one of the things, it's this brake lever, the fact that you're looking at Shimano Hydraulic disc brakes and looking at 12-speed. If you're looking at that combination of hydraulics and 12-speed in drop bar controls, you're basically looking at GRX, and you're not going to be able to equip this thing with GRX for probably anything less than $1,000 by the time you've changed your bars, put bar tape on, new derailleur, controls, all those sorts of things. And that is why we sort of say, yes, it's possible, but no, it's not practical. Now, one of the nice things with this being using mountain bike controls is the fact that we're looking at an 1150 gear range on this bike. And actually, here's a little extra about the drivetrain on this DSX2. Now, one of the things, this is a Shimano Deore 12-speed drivetrain. We've got a 42 tooth narrow wide steel chainring on these cranks here, but something I just wanted to focus on, this chainring, or this cassette that's on this bike, this is an actual Shimano 10 to 51 tooth 12-speed cassette, and to be able to put that on means that they've actually had to use a Shimano hub on here. The spec, if you go to Marin's website, is for this bike to have an 11 to 51 tooth Sunrace cassette, which would then mean that Marin would be able to use a no-name hub in there. And in addition, it was also spec'd with a KMC chain, and this is actually coming with a Shimano chain on here. So depending on what production run you get your bike from, you may or may not be getting this full Deore derailleur cassette and chain on your bike. Now, I think Marin's strategy on this is probably pretty wise. There may be some inconsistencies in supply on drivetrains, and so Shimano is advertising their bike with that slightly lower spec Sunrace and KMC spec on there, so that anybody that receives this full Deore cassette, chain, and derailleur setup is basically going to feel like they're just getting a bonus gift. But really, really good drivetrain. You're going to have good smooth shifting on here. These Deore cassettes, one of the big differences between them and stepping up to an SLX or an XT cassette is the fact that we have all steel rings on here, which makes this a little bit of a heavy cassette. So if you ever wanted to lighten your bike, you could, just by changing out your cassette, you could do it. But these steel rings will tend to give you a really long lifespan out of your cassette. So there is some reason to be excited there. Same thing, that Sunrace cassette that some of you might get then in the future, that's an all steel cassette as well. Of course, on this, being a Deore mountain bike derailleur, we do have a clutch. This clutch here means that when it's off, you can easily sort of move this lower portion, the cage, back and forth. When it's on, it stiffens things up. That is so that it's designed that when you're riding, you're always going to have it in the on position where it is now, and that is basically helping to add some tension to your chain, so that combined with your narrow wide chainring that you have on here really means that you can go bashing around in some bumpy stuff and not really have any worries about your chain bouncing off. The reason that they give you an off feature here, so making it really easy for the cage to swing forward, is so that if you ever have to take off a wheel to sort out a flat tire or anything, you aren't going to be battling a whole bunch of extra tension there. So for those people that ask, why do you have an off feature on something that's supposed to be on all the time? That is your practical guide. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of extra information about this drivetrain, and how, depending on your luck, if you're shopping for one of these in the future, you may or may not be getting a full Deore derailleur cassette, chain, and Shimano hub on the bike you get. If you do get the Sunrace one, I still think that they're perfectly fine. I have used Sunrace myself to sort of test them out, and you still get some really nice shifting out of them. They still have things like these shifting ramps that you have that is part of the magic that makes Shimano cassettes work really well. You still get all that sort of stuff, so nothing to worry about. But there is a potential that you're getting the bonus gift of a whole bunch of Deore and a slightly harder hard gear by going down to 10 teeth if you get this Shimano Deore cassette version. Okay, back to the regular schedule program. On here, so that is something that, once again, if you were into the drop bar gravel world, you would have to be looking at a GRX pretty high-end group set to get into that, and you're for sure then comparing this being a $1,600 bike in Canada to likely something at the cheapest starting just below $3,000 for a drop barred equivalent. So that's the standout here. Those drop handlebars save you a pile of money, and for mountain bikers it puts you in a really, really familiar position, not in that sort of stretched a little bit further position where you're reaching over the hoods to get a hold of your brakes. This thing, you're familiar, you're comfortable. If you wanted to, one of the things that we suggest, as well as doing those riser handlebars here, is also putting on some bar ends, and that will at least give you a couple distinct sort of hand positions for if you want to really put in some long miles and want to give your shoulders, your hands, arms, all that sort of stuff a little bit of relief from being in a really static position. putting some bar ends on a bike like this makes it a pretty magical beast for long rides. Spec sheet. On the side that you can't see, which I'll show you in a minute, we've got 160mm rotors front and back and Shimano hydraulic disc brakes. Now, one of the special things on this bike is we have holes on the down tube and on the seat tube here, and that is so that you can end up putting a dropper seat post on this bike, and that is another thing that would make this quite widely versatile as far as its uses. Beyond that dropper seat post, for versatility, I mentioned we've got 45mm wide tires on here. This thing, I have 2.1mm or 2.1 inch tires on my gravel bike with the same axle setup. And so I was able to test this bike, and yes, my 29 by 2.1 wheels and tires actually fit on this bike. So this has huge versatility if you want to put on a thicker tire to do a little bit more as far as shooting across fields, anything like that, as part of your commute, as part of your gravel riding. It makes that possible and essentially turns this into an ultralight, rigid mountain bike on an extreme budget. In the other direction, if you ended up with using this for a lot of road, a lot of pavement commuting, you could, instead of having this 45mm wide tire on here with a little bit of this sort of tread pattern, you would be able to switch over to something smoother, harder, say in a 40mm wide tire, and this thing would be lightened up and be even that much more efficient on pavement. So huge versatility as part of this bike's special features. Now we're sitting here looking at the other side of the bike. We're looking at the carbon fork. We've got some nice internal cable routing here. That helps to keep things really clean on your fork legs. It also means that when you're using, or if you're using these three sort of cargo mounts here, you don't have a cable that you have to sort of work around at all. It is just within the fork, goes in there, comes out on the inside, on the back there. Those brakes that we're talking about, they're Shimano, they're flat mount brake, 160mm rotors with center lock attachment. Looking at our bottom bracket, this is a threaded bottom bracket. In this particular model, we step up to external bearings, which is what we're looking at basically there, with a pinch bolt style of crank. That is probably where I think this bike ends up being almost a pound lighter than the model below it. And I think that largely comes down to the quality of these cranks. The sort of bearing spindle setup is just a lighter setup than what we're used to seeing on square taper stuff. It also, while reducing weight, also makes it a little bit more of a robust system, longer lasting bearings when we're looking at these external bearings like this. Now, one thing of interest here, I know a lot of people aren't that interested in putting a kickstand on their bike, especially people who would watch these videos and they're bike nerds, but you do have a pretty neat system. You've got a couple hidden threaded bolts down here, and those, along with a little special bracket that Marin makes, allow you to put an 18mm standard direct mount kickstand on there, so you're not sort of putting something on that's clamping around your chainstay or down in this area, especially because here we don't even have the room. So at least it becomes a really nice, neat looking feature if you decide to put a kickstand on. Now, for those people who have been paying attention to DSXs for a while, this area of the frame here, this is going to be your distinctive sign that we're looking at the newest model. The old model had sort of a separate tube here with a little gap underneath. This one here, yeah, a little bit cleaner look, I think. Also, if you've been watching videos about these bikes for a while, these DSX models are a tad heavier than the previous. And I think what's happened there is that Marin realized that people were either using these as a little bit more mountain bikey than they ever would have sort of imagined, or that they're loading them up to go bike packing and doing that sort of stuff, which ends up putting quite a bit of stress on a frame. And so I think to get that little bit of extra weight, the tube thickness on all these tubes has just increased that little bit. This is, I mentioned the dropper post ports. These are just empty ports here. They've got a really clean, I like the way that they're running the internal cables on the new DSXs. Empty ports there, and then we've got the little port there, and once again right here showing where you'd be running your dropper. So it would go inside the frame, outside, back inside there. Two water bottle mounts on the front end of the bike, which I think is perfectly sufficient. if you were going somewhere that you needed way more, you can. On these things here, you use something like a Blackburn anything cage, and you would be able to strap on a couple massive water bottles there. I mentioned as we were talking about sort of the geometry and why this bike is a little bit unique as far as what makes it a really nice handling gravel bike. We have a couple things. We have this short end here, short rear end. That basically makes the bike to be quite an agile sort of a bike, especially when you're cornering, all that sort of stuff. And it tends to make the bike feel quite lively. Now, to counter that, what we would see on a lot of the bikes that this gets compared to, if it's the Trek FX Sport, something like that Specialized Cirrus, or a Giant Fast Road, a lot of those bikes will tend to be designed around having quite a long stem on there. This is not. This whole bike concept is borrowing a lot from mountain bikes, and that both comes from the fact that they're designing it to have this short 70mm stem, and then also the head tube angle here is more raked out than what one of those other sort of more traditional flat-barred road bikes would be. And now what that's going to give you is the rear end of the bike is giving you something that's going to make it quite agile, sporty, fast turning. The front end of the bike, they're kind of working in the other direction. That slack head tube angle is trying to give you some stability so that when you're in gravel and really hauling ass, you're going to have a bike that's going to feel kind of confident and stable. The other thing I find is as soon as you start sort of getting your front wheel kicked out further ahead, your bike starts to take on a little bit of a different personality. As far as when you're turning, it feels less like you're just turning your handlebars, and it is actually giving you nicer feedback if you're just leaning the bike to go around corners. So I sort of equate that to anybody in the ski world that would talk about old school straight skis compared to modern shaped skis. These ones are that shaped ski. So it's giving you that sort of nice carvy feeling as you're going around corners, and that's both in pavement or on any sort of trails. Handlebars, I think these are about a 720mm wide. As I mentioned with one of our most common recommendations on these bikes, this is a zero rise handlebar, and I do find the front end of these bikes, even with their pretty generous amount of spacers that they have under the stem, I find they just feel nicer for most people with a little bit of rise up here. It just puts you in a little bit more of a mountain bike position, which tends to be the consumer in many cases. Somebody who's really comfortable on a mountain bike is the person who is often appreciating what this bike offers. As well as that, putting the risers on, the other thing regarding sort of fit, I would say, is size up on this bike. I am 6-ish feet tall, and I would most definitely be leaning towards going extra large if I was going with a DSX. So that is basically putting me up from about the middle of being a size large in most brands and being very comfortable with the idea of going up to an extra large. What that also means is we don't carry these in size small very often anymore, because we just tend to find that there's not that many people that are sort of in the 5'2" or under sort of size asking about these bikes. I did give a hint mentioning the mountain biking. This really is an extremely welcoming way to get mountain bikers onto something that could be a gravel bike. And for the longest time, because there's so much sort of traditionalism, I guess, around having drop handlebars on your gravel bike, I think there was a little bit of hesitation from a lot of hardcore riders of going with something like this. But I'm getting the inkling that people are starting to like the idea of doing something like this and being more than willing to actually dress this thing up and making a high-end flat-barred bike, and being proud of the fact that no, it doesn't have drop handlebars, but when it comes to bike handling and a rider's comfort on the bike, that you basically are giving yourself just a wicked setup with the flat handlebars. And part of that sense is I'm feeling it in myself. I have been looking for inventory of this exact bike with the idea of getting it in that extra large. I would probably even then go up in size to extra large, put the riser handlebars on, shorten the stem, put mountain bike tires on, and this would quite easily be able to turn into a 25-pound bike that would be so much fun to blast around town, and I would probably go chasing some Strava segments on really, really smooth cross-country trails. So this is The DSX2, I'm just going to touch on a couple things for upgrades. Sorry to make this longer. The pedals on these bikes, I call these test ride pedals. That is a pretty poor quality pedal. It's just a nylon thing. The bearings tend to not be that good. If you ever get a wet foot on this pedal, you're going to slip off and you're going to mash your nuts in the top tube. So replace the pedals with something good, something that has some steel pins on it, like any of these things here. And those steel pin pedals will tend to also have really good quality bearings, so they'll last an awful long time. As well, so I talked about the fact that I would upgrade these handlebars to something with some rise. I would also put on some grips that maybe just feel a little bit nicer than these, and probably an ergonomic style lock-on grip, because I think that this is kind of a perfect application for those grips. And the ones I'm talking about are the ones that have a little bit of a wing coming out of the grip, that you kind of get a little bit more pressure relief on your palm. As well as things that I would personally upgrade on my own model, I would put a dropper post on. I personally think that droppers are, I mean, from the mountain bike world, you get to the point where you would feel naked riding without a dropper post, and I'm getting to that point on my gravel bike now. It's just so nice to be able to get your seat out of the way. Any other specs that people want to know about? As I mentioned, we've got a threaded bottom bracket. We've got standard 142 by 12 rear end on this bike. So that is pretty much, if you're talking about through axles on bikes, on gravel bikes these days, very standard. So we're not, even though we're looking at a bike that's sort of outside the traditional classification, not being a drop bar gravel bike, this is using standard gravel bike spacing both there and in the front end. So if you ever wanted to go crazy and do some really high-end wheels, any of those sorts of upgrades, you would be able to do it. Other things, this is a tapered steer tube on here as well, and that leads us to the fact that there is a model above this. It's in limited supply, but there is a thing called a DSX FS. So that FS is for fork de suspension or something, I don't know. It's the suspension fork version, but that does mean that this frame is designed to be somewhat suspension corrected, so that if you ever did want to put like a 40mm travel suspension fork on here, you could, or that DSX FS is an available model, although its price is a little bit north of this one. I think it's about a $2,100 bike, if I remember correctly. And that is the rundown of this 2026 Marin DSX2. And if you like nerding out on bikes, then maybe give this a like and subscribe and leave a comment, because I actually do learn a lot from the comments. And as I mentioned before, the fact that people made mention of things like fast roads and the Treks and the Specialized that kind of compare to the DSX, it does tell me what people are thinking or comparing to when I show a bike on this channel. So reporting to you from the service department check-in desk at Bike Bros, this is Graham, and thanks for checking out another Bike Bros bike review video.